welcome to the first episode of the SACNAS video series, Role Models in STEM. My name is Daryl Monto. I am the SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager. I'm also an enrolled member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma and Apache and Comanche descent. It is my pleasure to coordinate this presentation for our Native American and Indigenous community and for all SACNAS members. It is also my pleasure to introduce our special guest, SACNAS leadership alumna and role model, Dr. Rosalyn LaPier. Dr. LaPier is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe from Montana and is also Métis. She received her BA in physics and a PhD in environmental history. In addition to being a faculty member at the University of Montana, she is an award-winning writer with numerous articles and several published books. She is an advocate for Indigenous people, and her work has centered on language revitalization, environmental justice in Indigenous communities, and she is committed to strengthening the traditional environmental knowledge. She is an alumna of the Linton Poudry SACNAS Leadership Institute and was a featured speaker at the SACNAS National Diversity STEM Conference. We are very pleased to have her join us and share her story. Thank you, Dr. LaPier, for taking time and being part of this new SACNAS initiative.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity to share with the SACNAS community.
We appreciate that so much. Well, we'll go ahead and jump right into the interview. So Dr. LaPier, can you share with us your journey from leaving your home area for college to your current position as a faculty member at the University of Montana?
So, sure. So I am originally from the Blackfeet Reservation, but I also grew up kind of all around the Pacific Northwest. So I also lived in Washington State and Oregon because my family worked primarily as migrant farm workers and other positions as well. But when you are a migrant farm worker, you're often going from where you work and then sort of back to home. So I did a lot of sort of working someplace in the fall and then going back to the Blackfeet Reservation and then going someplace in the spring and then going back to the Blackfeet Reservation. And that was very common when I was growing up for a lot of Native people, Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest working as migrant farm workers. And so my early kind of life was living that kind of lifestyle. And so I went from that to when I was applying for college. I knew I wanted to leave the state of Montana, and I had already had experience in other places. And so I was looking for a position, looking for a college somewhere that I could study math and science, because I was really interested in math and science. And so my sights actually were set to go to Seattle. I had applied to the University of Washington, and I was really interested in, at that time, kind of like aerospace and like becoming an astronaut and that kind of stuff. And but then my senior year of high school, a small liberal arts school in Colorado called Colorado College had partnered with a nonprofit in Denver called the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, or CERT. And they were recruiting Native students to go to Colorado College. And so I just sort of like, on the fly kind of applied and got into Colorado College. And that's where I went, eventually went. I was able to get a scholarship to go there, and I got a degree in physics. And so, like I said, kind of math and science was my love. And I actually started as a math, major, and realized kind of partway through in my math program that math was not for me, and switched to physics. And after I graduated, I then went to work for CERT, again, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes in Denver, as a research associate for a couple of years. And while I was at CERT, so just to explain what CERT is, so CERT was a national nonprofit organization that addressed issues of natural resource development on reservation communities. And so they provided technical assistance. So they had, geologists, and they had attorneys, and they had people who addressed kind of natural resources and helped provide tribes that technical assistance so tribes could make decisions on their own about whether or not they wanted to do natural resource development or they did not want to do natural resource development. So provided that kind of technical assistance. So I worked there for a couple of years, and that was really what got me down the path of being interested in the environment and interested in what I ultimately, years later, got a PhD in, which was environmental history, because I was really interested in how Native people connected to the natural world and asking those kind of big questions. Years later, there's a long story of how I got there. Years later, I went and got a PhD in environmental history as an adult. And it really, that is now my second career, is working now as a professor in an environmental studies / environmental science department at the University of Montana. And so now I've returned back home. And so Montana is my home, and this is where I grew up. And it is really great to be able to, especially if you're an Indigenous person, to return near your home place, to be able to teach and work with students and have an impact in communities that are near where you are from.
Sure. That's great. That's great. That's really good. So who were your role models or your inspirations growing up?
So that's a great question. So I grew up around a lot of old people. So I grew up living in my grandparents' home on and off most of my childhood. And my grandmother had several sisters who were always sort of around her house. And so when I was growing up, my role models were these old women, right? And I ultimately learned ethnobotany from my grandmother and my aunt, not as a child, but as an adult later. And so because I was always around these old women who were really highly respected, highly regarded in our community, that when I was young, young as in college age young, I wanted to be an old woman, right? So unlike some people today who want to, like their role model or the person they look up to might be like a Hollywood, actor or something. When I was growing up, it was like old women. I used to dress like an old woman. People used to tease me about it, like that I always dressed in like flashy colors and like big floral. I still do that. Button-down shirts with big flowers all over it. So, but I think that was because I was around old women. I really saw the respect that our communities hold for those women, and just the knowledge that they held was really just something that I really admired. And because of that those were the people who I always looked up to and really were my role models for the rest of my life.
Sure. Great. What were some valuable lessons or teachings you learned along your journey that really made an impact on you?
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot of things that can happen over the course of your lifetime that can impact your journey, whether it's a journey as part of your career or personal life. And I would just say that when I first worked at the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, when I first graduated with my bachelor's degree, one of the leaders there kind of took me aside and told me that I would have multiple kind of careers and multiple jobs in my lifetime. And one of the things he was trying to say to me was, don't worry, this is not going to be the only job you'll ever have, being a research, associate here. But he was trying to say that over my lifetime that there would be like kind of these key moments where I would just kind of completely change and have a completely different sort of career path. And that really has happened for me. I really have had sort of 3 different time periods in my life where I've done 3 different things. So I went from working at CERT to working at a tribal college, and I worked there for about 10 years. I went from that tribal college to working for a Native nonprofit on the Blackfeet Reservation, again, for about 10 years. And now I've been at the University of Montana going on my 9th year. So I really have sort of, as he had kind of told me, predicted different sort of time periods of my life where I would have a completely different sort of career path. And I think that that has happened. And I think it was helpful as a young person when I first graduated from college to hear that message, because I knew that when those times came when I would completely switch and do something different, that I was still on the journey that was laid out for me.
Yeah, that's good. So my next question, kind of going back to your education, academic experience, did you encounter barriers to your learning or to your research? And if so, what advice do you have for our STEM students to try to help them navigate through those challenges?
So I think so that, again, another great question. I think that my experience in terms of addressing barriers or overcoming barriers really started at elementary school. So as I had mentioned earlier, because of the jobs that my family had, we did move around a lot. And I went back and forth again between sort of a on-reservation school system to an off-reservation school system. And because of that, I had to overcome not having the best education at the elementary level and secondary level by the time I went to college. And even though I loved math and science, right, when I got to college, I was not prepared. I was definitely not prepared. And so that was something that I had to overcome personally. So because I had gone to a lot of different school systems, and I had also gone to a reservation school system that did not have a strength in math and science, that was something I personally had to overcome. And so I did have to work really hard to address that. But I also was able then eventually, even at the undergraduate level, for example, one of my student study work jobs was to be a tutor, right? I became a tutor in the physics department, where then I helped other students learn physics. So I think it's even though I had that, I had to overcome that particular barrier of not having adequate education when I got to college. It was something that I was able to overcome. But I would also encourage students that in that process, you really have to be your own personal advocate, and you have to find those people on campus who are going to be your allies for you. Because if you're not the one saying, hey, I need help, then people aren't going to kind of look at you and say, do you need help? You know, you have to be the one that says, hey, I need the help, and here, you know, can you, help me address this or that, whatever it is. So I think that was something that no one had actually taught me to like be my own advocate, but it's something that I evolved to do. But it's something now I encourage students to always advocate for themselves, because people are not going to do it for you. There are great programs out there now, individuals out there now, student groups out there now that are going to assist students, like SACNAS, of course. But still, even with those all out there, you still have to advocate for yourself, stand up for yourself, ask those questions, and when you need help, say, hey, I need help doing whatever it is, XYZ, because I didn't have the best high school that I went to. I didn't have, I need to, and one of the things that I always tell students is that, there really is a difference between intellect and skill. So you can have high intellectual ability, but you may not have the skill. And those are two different things. And so you may not have the skill of having, again, go into your college program having had upper level calculus, right? At your high school. I definitely didn't. And so when you're then starting your program, you know, those are skills that you just have to learn. And you do have to take those classes and build your, you know, it's kind of a building block. So skill and intellectual ability, two completely different things. So that, but that's something when you're advocating for yourself, you can remind the people in your program about that and just say, I have the intellectual ability to do this. I just don't have the skill level. So please help me build that skill level so I can go to that next, take that next class, complete this program because I want to complete this program and move to the next level, whether it's graduate school or continuing your career.
Very, very good advice. Wow, thank you for sharing all of that. It's great. So you do so much work in many areas, language revitalization, working with Indigenous communities for environmental justice, and also strengthening traditional environmental knowledge. Does one area stand out more for you, or are you able to combine all your efforts and make them work together?
So one thing does stand out for me, and that is Native American languages. So I do not have any education in terms of like higher education in Native American language. I'm not a linguist. I also, you know, I also don't teach about Native American languages. So in my day-to-day kind of life as a college professor, you know, I teach environmental science classes. I teach environmental studies classes. I teach classes on traditional ecological knowledge. I don't teach linguistics, but I think that Native American languages are the foundation of our understanding of Indigenous knowledge. It's the foundation for understanding traditional ecological knowledge. I think embedded within Native American languages is where you find those things. I think that you know, it's difficult to, for example, study ethnobotany, which is something that is near and dear to my heart and that I work with students on without starting with language first. So because of that, as young people say, you know, my side hustle is Indigenous languages. So oftentimes, you know, I will come home from work and then work on advocating for Indigenous languages. So for example, right now, the latest COVID relief bill is going to be, it is already being discussed in Congress. And as part of that new COVID relief bill, we are trying to add Indigenous languages into that because there are a lot of Native American language programs, Native American language schools that are also being impacted because of the economic crisis related to COVID-19. And we're also seeing in some communities where elders are passing from COVID-related illnesses. And so because of that, we really truly need to address Native American languages and have them included as part of these relief efforts that Congress is doing. And so just today, I've been working on calling different folks, contacting different people, encouraging people to contact their congressional representatives to ask for funding related to Native American language schools and programs so that they can continue their work, they can continue their revitalization efforts to address, you know, helping save our Native American languages. Again, because I see that connection between Native languages and traditional knowledge, ethnobotany, Indigenous knowledge. It's just all embedded within our languages, which is why we really need to save them.
Sure, sure. Wow, that's great, great. Thank you for doing that work. It's so important, very important. So my next question, looking at our Indigenous identity, How important is that to you as a scholar in STEM?
That's a great question. Another great question. So I think, I think it's, let me just say this, I think it's different for different scholars depending on what work they do. So for example, this morning I was visiting with another professor at the University of Montana who is working on developing a vaccine for COVID-19. If I were doing that right now, I would bring parts of my kind of community, family, cultural identity to that work. But that type of work is very different than kind of the scholarly work that I do. So I do, ethnobotanical research. So I am talking to elders in the community. I am talking to other indigenous people. So my particular field of scholarship is really embedded within indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge bases. Whereas other types of scientific work, again, if you're a microbiologist or if you're a chemist, may not be completely embedded within kind of those indigenous knowledge frameworks. But I think no matter what you do, whether it is something kind of like what I do, kind of the ethnobotanical work, or whether it's something where if you're just sort of like, kind of hard science like chemist, you still always bring your culture and community with you because whether or not you're doing something like I mentioned earlier, a fellow professor who's working on a vaccine for COVID-19, ultimately, that's the type of thing that is going to benefit your Native community, even if it's not something that's directly tied to indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. So I think that as an indigenous person, you carry your community and family wherever you go. And it's something that oftentimes is just really embedded in you as a person. And so it's really hard to sort of separate those things out.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. It's great. So what research are you working on now, or have you recently been involved with?
So I'm very fortunate this year that in the coming year, I will be on sabbatical. So I'm going to be working on a couple of different research projects that I've been working on for the past several years, and they're very different. So one research project is an ethnobotanical project where I'm looking at plants that are used for purification. And so I'm looking at plants that were used for what we also call quote unquote smudging, but it's purification. So the tentative title of that work is Plants That Purify, the Natural and Supernatural History of Smudging. And what I'm looking at is all of the different plants that have been used for the Blackfeet tribe over time for different methods of purification. And I started that particular project because an elder in the community had asked me to make a list. It started with, he said, make a list of all the plants that we use for purification because, young people are forgetting what these plants are and young people are only using a couple plants, right? So we can name those plants, right? Most people use sweetgrass, most people use sage. Some tribes also use other, like cedar or subalpine fir. So most people can name a couple plants, but they can't name more than that. And so he had asked me, like, make a list so that our young people will know, what this list is, all these different plants. And I said, oh, okay. And this was a long time ago that he asked me this. So I started making this list then. And then I started with the plants that I knew. Then I went to elders and I interviewed them and asked for sort of more plants. I went to natural history museums and started looking within their records to see what elders of the past had said And at least for the Blackfeet, I've now have a list of more than 36 plants that the Blackfeet have used for purification purposes. So it's not just kind of those couple that everybody knows, but it's a much, much longer list. And he knew that when he originally asked me, you know, to kind of document this information. So I started with that list, but then I decided along the line that, hey, there's something more here. There's a bigger story about the relationship between Indigenous people and the natural world. There's a bigger story here about the relationship between Indigenous people and the plant world, or the plant world. And so I wanted to be able to sort of tell that story. So I've been working on this project now for about 3 years, and I'm hoping in sabbatical I get kind of most of it completed and move on to having a book ultimately published about this particular topic. So.
That's wonderful. That's definitely needed, and wow, something I'd be interested in reading and definitely learning more about too. That's great. That's great.
And then I have, so then the second project I'm working on, again, completely different than that one, which is, I became really interested since Standing Rock to think about environmental activism and environmental protests. And so I was really interested in sort of what was happening at environmental protests, especially in terms of women and what women were doing, the leadership roles that women were taking, and how what I was seeing happening at some environmental activism, that women were bringing to that activism, not just quote unquote, right, protesting against environmental issues, but also bringing our Indigenous religious practices to that space. And so how environmental activism and environmental kind of protesting was more than just protesting. It was also places where people began to rethink their role in terms of cultural practice and religious practice within their own communities. And it also became a place where Indigenous women really kind of stepped up and sanctified or made sacred those spaces where environmental activism was occurring. And I'll just kind of give one example in terms of that. One of the things that you're increasingly seeing at Indigenous environmental activist spaces is Indigenous women wearing jingle dresses, right? And Indigenous women singing particular songs connected to jingle dress dancing. And as we know, jingle dresses have a history that they are healing dresses, right? That they have that kind of sacred connection. And so when we see Indigenous women wearing jingle dresses at environmental protests, they are bringing that kind of religious and sacred connection to that space. And so anyway, I became really interested in all of these connections between kind of environmental activism, Indigenous women's leadership, but then also religious practice. So in the coming year, I was really lucky to receive a national fellowship with the ACLS, which is the American Council on Learned Societies. And they provided me a fellowship this year to write about that, to write about Indigenous activism, and especially the role of women and the connection to environmental protests also being spaces of religious practice and activity.
Congratulations on that. It's very deserving, and you're going to do, I mean, such an interesting area to look further into and to share information and bring information. So that's exciting too. It's great.
Thank you.
So I know that you had recently wrote a article back in April discussing COVID-19. And so my next question is, what, in your point of view, do Indigenous communities need to be aware of or informed about regarding COVID-19?
So, in March, when COVID-19 was sort of becoming part of the national discussion here in the United States, one of the things that I was seeing especially on social media, one of the things I was seeing shared on social media was a lot of what I view as kind of both misinformation, but also misleading information about what particular plants and herbs could do to either treat, cure, or prevent COVID-19. And so myself and a public health graduate student at that time, they have now graduated, so now they have their MPH. We co-wrote a article where we just said that within Indigenous communities, it was really sort of like malpractice. It was, ethnobotanical malpractice to be sharing this information, saying that certain plants or certain herbs could, treat COVID-19 or cure COVID-19 when they cannot, that we know of yet. Let me just say that much. COVID-19, the coronavirus is a novel coronavirus, so it's a new coronavirus, which means, new means new. Which means that we don't have or we don't know of preventions or cures yet. So one of the things I wanted to share was that, but I also wanted to share, and I continue to share with people, is that at this time, no one is immune to this. There are no preventions, there are no cures, there are no treatments. And so really our only prevention is not to get it, which is why social distancing is so important, why washing your hands is so important, why now if you're out in public wearing masks, so you're not accidentally spreading COVID-19 to others is important. So I think that it's really important, I think, especially for Indigenous communities, to remind ourselves of our own history and remind ourselves of the impact of disease, epidemics, pandemics on our own community, because we have been devastated in the past by epidemics and by diseases that we are not immune to. And because of that, we need to be much more aware, much more making sure that we are protecting our own people. Again, we're already seeing this in some communities who are completely devastated by COVID-19, with the high numbers of people who are experiencing this illness, the high rates of death in certain communities. It is really, really sad, and something that other communities are now trying to address by having, completely shutting off their communities and closing borders, having, kind of the stop points and that sort of thing. And I think that that is something that Indigenous people need to really kind of take seriously and address seriously. And again, we're not immune to this. No one is immune to this. It doesn't matter your age, your race, your ethnic group. We are not immune as humans at this time, but people are working on addressing this. As we know, people around the world are now kind of working on a vaccine, working on treatments. I'm hopeful that we will find some of those treatments and cures, in the ethnobotanical world. I am hoping that we do find cures within our, native plant species. And there are people who are working on addressing that. At this time, though, we don't know of any that actually do. And so that's why we need to kind of be eternally vigilant at this time to make sure that we stay safe. And again, the only prevention is don't get it. Yeah, so.
Thank you for sharing all of that. So, in these uncertain times, a lot of academic institutions, along with their students, have had to adjust and adapt. And working, has changed. Everything's moved to online, remote learning. What advice do you have for our students in STEM, especially our Native students that are trying to work through this time?
So yeah, that's a great question. So during this time when it is, we are kind of going through an unprecedented time right now in terms of the global community, right? We're all trying to address this particular disease, this particular pandemic. And really the best method to address this is through social distancing, which then means we're all going, as with this interview, we're all going to remote communication. I think the best advice I have for students is to try and stay as motivated as possible. I know that SACNAS has recently put out some what I call memes, but kind of infographics that are trying to encourage students to stay motivated, and I think that it's very hard to do. It's very hard for professors to do as well, but I think that that's really important to stay motivated through these times. I think the other thing is what I had mentioned earlier is to advocate for yourself, to make sure you're your own best advocate. If you are having concerns or issues with a particular class, definitely contact people. Contact the professor, contact the director of the program, contact other student programs on campus, and see what resources are out there to help you. I think it's extremely difficult, and I have talked with other professors, especially professors who have labs. It is really hard to kind of do a lab on, on remotely. So those transitions are tough for professors as well. But yeah, I think my advice to students is try to stay as motivated as possible, and to advocate for yourself, for sure. Contact people, call them. You can no longer stop by somebody's office and just kind of knock on the door and say, hey, I have a question. But you can email people, you can ask for a Zoom meeting, or some sort of, video meeting to get your concerns addressed.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that advice. So my last question, we're going to be wrapping up here pretty soon. As an active member of SACNAS, of the SACNAS community, can you share your most memorable SACNAS moment?
So SACNAS is amazing because it is a community. Even though it's both a physical community when we see people, especially at the national conference, but it's also a great community, I would say primarily on like social media, right? It's a great community where people continue to speak with each other, talk to each other throughout the year, learn about each other, share information, so professors that I have met through SACNAS, we continue to, visit again via social media, share what we're doing with each other. And then when we go places, so for example, exactly a year ago, I was in Hawaii for 5 months because I had a fellowship at the East-West Center. So I was doing research there, but then there were also other SACNAS members, right, that were on Oahu. So I visited with them on and off throughout the 5 months that I was there. But one of the SACNAS members, I'll call her out right now. Her name's Olivia George. She's a biologist. She's Dene, she's Navajo. She works at the University of Hawaii at West Oahu. And she took me out on some of the things that she did. So for example, again, I'm an ethnobotanist. I'm all about plants. But she was doing some citizen science, right? Some community volunteering with a group that was doing research on these little teeny tiny shrimp, like so small, they can't even, and so I went out with her a few times and with the other students who were doing the citizen science of counting shrimp in the dark at night, like totally out of my realm of experience, but it was so much fun. And I learned a lot while I was there, you know, kind of stepped out of my comfort zone to sit in the dark when there was like scorpions and like creepy crawly things as we were counting these microscopic shrimp. But that was so much fun, and it was something that I was able to do because of Dr. George of Olivia and the work that she does there. And so that was a serious, like, you know, great SACNAS connection. But part of that SACNAS community that no matter where you go, there's going to be a SACNAS member there that you can always, you know, connect up with, and they will take you places and teach you new things that you did not know that you were interested in or that you could go and experience. So that's always fun about the SACNAS community, is just kind of SACNAS is everywhere. And so you can always tap into those great networks. And I always encourage students to do that, and also, you know, professors as well.
Great. It's a great story. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. LaPier, for taking time to share your story with us and giving back to the SACNAS community. We really, truly appreciate it. And I'm so excited now that you're our first feature for our role models in STEM. So really, thank you. Thank you. And of course, we want to thank our viewers. And if you would like to learn more about Dr. LaPier's work, please connect with her in our SACNAS online community. You can sign up or sign in at membership.sacnas.org to join our national network and to get notified about our next episode and upcoming webinars that we'll be hosting as well. SACNAS is working to provide more virtual programming, and we want to hear from you on what you would like to see and hear. If you have an idea or a suggestion, please send us an email at info@sacnas.org. Thank you again for taking time to join us.